The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl whisper, "I can't swim," as the car sank and his answer tore through the storm. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the heart of this gripping tale. On a dark and stormy night, the relentless rain hammered the streets, the sky a furious canvas of swirling black clouds. Amidst the chaos of the downpour, the sound of a car engine sputtering to its last breath echoed in the distance. A silver sedan, struggling against the ferocious current of the flooded road, was quickly sinking into the murky depths of a swollen river. Inside, a terrified little girl clung to the back seat, her wide eyes filled with fear as the water crept higher, inching closer to her small frame. She could feel the cold grip of panic tightening in her chest, but she knew she had only moments left. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm, "I can't swim." At that exact moment, Jake Reaper Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, was riding through the storm, his Harley-Davidson slicing through the wind like a beast on the prowl. He had seen storms like this before, the kind that soaked you to the bone and tried to steal your will to keep going. But this storm felt different. It wasn't just the rain, it was something about the air, something that didn't sit right with him. As his tires screeched around the corner, he spotted the silver sedan, sinking lower into the water with every passing second. Without a second thought, Jake slammed on the brakes, his boots hitting the wet pavement as he jumped off his bike, instinct taking over. He rushed toward the car, the storm lashing against his face, the wind pushing him back, but he wouldn't be stopped. His hands were rough, his leather jacket soaked through, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting that little girl out. The water was now knee-deep, and Jake could see the fear in her eyes as she struggled to stay above the rising tide. She was so small, so vulnerable, and it tore at his heart. He called out to her, his voice cutting through the storm, "Don't worry, I'm here to help you." At first, the little girl flinched, her wide eyes locked onto him with suspicion. The leather jacket, the tattoos, the intimidating persona of a biker, she didn't know whether to trust him or run. But Jake's voice was calm, steady, and he reached for her, offering his hand with a gentle assurance that surprised even him. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was something else, something her fear couldn't quite grasp yet. As he lifted her from the back seat, the sound of the car's engine sputtered one last time, then went silent as the water finally claimed it. Holding her close, he waded through the raging current, feeling the weight of the storm but also the weight of the promise he had just made to her, a promise that no matter how dark it got, he would keep her safe. The rain seemed to pause for just a moment, as if giving them a brief respite from the chaos. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop, not even when the sound of a distant voice called out to him. This wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The storm raged on, but Jake didn't stop. He carried the little girl through the rushing floodwaters, his boots slipping on the slick ground, but his resolve unshaken. He felt the weight of her fragile body in his arms, her small hands gripping his jacket as if she were afraid he might disappear if she let go. Her heart was pounding, but the warmth of his arms was a reminder that she wasn't alone. Every step through the knee-deep water felt like an eternity, but Jake's focus never wavered. All that mattered was getting her to safety. As they reached the bank, the wind howled, pushing against them, but Jake's grip never faltered. He could see his bike in the distance, the headlights cutting through the storm, and he knew that he had to get her there, away from the rising flood. He could feel her shivering, and it wasn't just from the cold. She was scared. She had every reason to be. With one last push, Jake reached the shoreline and carefully set her down on solid ground. The car was now nothing more than a sinking metal shell, consumed by the waters. The storm didn't seem to care, but for a moment, Jake allowed himself to take a breath. He wiped the rain from his face, the water stinging his skin, and looked down at the girl. She was shivering, her wet clothes clinging to her small frame. Her eyes were wide, still filled with that mix of fear and confusion. He knew she needed more than just physical warmth. She needed to feel safe. Jake crouched down, his voice soft yet firm. Hey, it's all right. You're safe now. You're not alone. She looked up at him, her face streaked with rain and tears, her small voice barely a whisper. I didn't think anyone would come. I thought I was going to die in there. Jake's heart clenched. He could feel the weight of her words more than he wanted to. He had seen too much in his life, been through too many wars, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of this moment. He placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer reassurance, though the storm outside seemed determined to drown them both. Well, you're wrong, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. You're not going anywhere. Not today, not ever. She clung to him, her small body trembling as the reality of the situation sank in. The storm still howled, but Jake knew he had to get her out of here. He stood up and lifted her once again, cradling her close as he made his way back toward his bike. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to keep going, for her. By the time they reached the bike, Jake was exhausted, but the look in her eyes kept him going. He gently placed her on the back of the Harley, holding her in place as he climbed on in front of her. He started the engine, the roar of the bike cutting through the storm, and then he took off, speeding down the flooded road. The rain kept coming, but Jake didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. His heart was racing, his hands gripping the handlebars with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. The wind and rain lashed against them, but Jake's focus was unbreakable. He couldn't think about anything except getting them to safety. As the town came into view, the storm began to let up, the rain lightening to a steady drizzle. Jake's heart still pounded in his chest, but the worst of it was over. They were almost there. He could see the lights of the small motel up ahead, the place he had called home for the last few weeks, a place where he could finally rest, even if just for a night. He pulled into the parking lot, stopping the bike in front of his room. He glanced behind him, checking on the little girl. She was still holding on tightly, but her eyes were beginning to close, exhaustion finally catching up with her. He helped her off the bike, supporting her as they walked to the door. Once inside, he wrapped her in the warmest blanket he could find, setting her down on the bed. She didn't say much, just nodded off to sleep, her tiny body still trembling from the cold. Jake took a seat in the chair by the window, watching the storm slowly fade into the distance. His mind was racing, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The storm outside was subsiding, but Jake knew that his own storm was just beginning. The girl was safe for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple rescue. He had a feeling that the storm was far from over. The night was quiet now, the storm having passed, leaving only the soft patter of rain against the motel window. Jake sat in the chair by the bed, his eyes never leaving the little girl as she slept under the blanket. He could still feel the cold water soaking through his clothes, but the warmth from the small heater in the room was slowly seeping into his bones. He thought about the storm, about how it had almost taken her, and how, in the midst of it all, he had found himself protecting someone other than himself for the first time in years. He had always been a loner, a man, defined by his past and the hard exterior he wore like armor. But tonight, something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't quite understand. He had acted without thinking, instinctively, without the usual hesitation or cynicism. And now, here he was, in a small motel room, with a child he had just saved, and he didn't know what to do next. The girl stirred in her sleep, her small hand twitching as if chasing away a bad dream. Jake stood up and moved quietly toward the bed, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He sat down beside her, gently brushing a strand of wet hair from her forehead. She looked so fragile, so small, and it made his chest tighten. She had been through so much, and yet, here she was alive. Alive because of him. He thought back to the moment when he had first heard her whisper, "I can't swim," and how everything had changed in an instant. He had been on that road, just another biker trying to get through a storm, when he had heard that desperate cry for help. He hadn't thought about it, hadn't hesitated. He had just done what needed to be done. But now, sitting here with her, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something bigger, something he wasn't ready for. He stood up and walked over to the small table by the window, grabbing a towel from his bag to dry off. He needed to clear his head, but before he could do anything, the girl stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with confusion. Where am I? She asked, her voice small and tired. Jake smiled softly, trying to ease her fear. You're safe now. You're in a place where nothing's going to hurt you. She blinked, taking in her surroundings, then her eyes settled on him. I don't know what happened, she said, her voice trembling. You were in the car, remember? The storm, the water. Jake began, his voice steady but soft. The girl nodded, her small face crumpling with emotion. I thought I was going to die. I didn't think anyone would help me. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't sure why it affected him so much, but it did. Maybe it was the rawness in her voice, the fear that had been in her eyes before she fell asleep. He walked over to the bed, sitting down next to her again. You're here now, he said, his voice softer than before. And you're not alone. The girl looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to make Jake's heart skip a beat. He nodded, not knowing what else to say. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the rain outside was the only noise in the room, a quiet reminder that the storm had passed, but its effects would linger. Finally, Jake broke the silence. What's your name? He asked gently. The girl hesitated for a moment, then spoke. Emma, she said, her voice still fragile. Emma. Jake repeated her name, savoring the sound of it. Well, Emma, I'm Jake, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to make sure you're all right. She looked up at him, the fear still in her eyes, but there was something else there now. Something that wasn't there before. Hope. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice cracking. I don't have anyone. I don't know where to go. Jake felt a pang in his chest. He had never been the kind of person to offer comfort, to tell someone everything would be okay. But now, for some reason, he couldn't help but want to reassure her. You do now, he said, his voice calm and firm. You've got me. She looked at him, the silence hanging heavy between them. Jake didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew he couldn't turn his back on her. The storm outside had passed, but another kind of storm was brewing inside him. A storm of responsibility, of choices he hadn't been prepared to make. But Emma needed him, and he wasn't about to let her down. As the rain continued to fall, Jake sat by her side, watching over her, wondering what the next chapter would bring. The morning light filtered softly through the cracks in the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Jake sat in the same chair, his mind racing through the events of the night. The storm had passed, but it felt like the calm before a new kind of storm, one he wasn't prepared for. Emma was still asleep, curled up under the blanket, her face peaceful for the moment. Jake couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way, responsible for someone else. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, one he wasn't sure he liked, but it was there, pressing on his chest like a weight. He had always been a loner, and even when he had been part of the Hells Angels, it had been about the ride, the freedom, the brotherhood, but never anything like this. Looking at Emma now, he couldn't deny that something had changed inside him. She had come to him in her moment of need, and he had done what he thought was right. But now, with her safe and the storm outside gone, he was left with the lingering question, what now? Jake stood and walked toward the small window, glancing out at the wet streets below. The world was still recovering from the storm, but Jake's mind was on the girl in the bed. She was safe, for now, but she was alone. Her parents weren't here, and Jake knew she had no one left to turn to. He had no idea where she had come from or how she had ended up in the car last night. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her go back out into that world alone. He couldn't be the one who just walked away. That wasn't who he was anymore. But he also knew that offering her a place to stay wasn't going to be enough. She needed more than that. She needed answers. What happened to her family? Where was she supposed to go next? Jake had no answers. He was just a biker, a man who had spent most of his life running from responsibility. But now, he couldn't just ignore her. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Jake's attention snapped back to her. Her small figure looked so fragile against the pillow, her dark hair falling across her face. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her, feeling the weight of his decision settle on him. She needed help, and he was the only one who could give it to her. He walked back over to the bed, his boots making soft sounds on the floor. As he sat down next to her, she shifted in her sleep, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she didn't recognize him, her gaze confused, but then her eyes focused, and she seemed to remember. You're awake, he said quietly. She nodded, slowly sitting up, looking around the room. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice small and still fragile from the storm. "We're safe," Jake replied, trying to offer reassurance. "You're at my place. You're okay now." She looked at him, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. It was a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She didn't know him. She didn't trust him, not fully, and Jake understood that. But he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't just going to drop her off at a shelter or leave her on the side of the road like so many others would. She was different. There was something in her eyes, something that made Jake feel like he couldn't just walk away. "Thank you," Emma said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me." Jake shook his head, not knowing how to respond to that. He wasn't a hero. He had never been one. He had just done what needed to be done. But hearing her words, seeing the gratitude in her eyes, made something inside him stir. "I'm just glad I was there," he said, his voice rough. He didn't want to get too deep into it. Didn't want to make this more than it was. She was a kid who had just been through something terrible. She didn't need to hear him talk about his past. But Emma wasn't finished. "I don't know what to do now," she said, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't have anyone." Jake's heart tightened. He could see the pain in her eyes, the loneliness that had nothing to do with the storm or the car crash. She was scared. She was lost. And Jake realized he had no idea how to fix it. All he knew was that he couldn't let her go. "You're not alone," he said, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "You have me." Emma looked at him, her eyes wide, as if she was trying to decide whether to believe him. Jake didn't blame her for being cautious. He didn't trust anyone either, but something about her made him want to protect her. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because she reminded him of someone he had lost a long time ago. "But what about my family?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What if they're looking for me?" Jake took a deep breath. He had no answers, no way to reassure her. He had no idea what had happened to her family, but he could guess it wasn't good. "We'll figure that out," he said, trying to sound confident. "For now, you're safe here. And that's all that matters." Emma nodded, though her face was still full of uncertainty. Jake didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to leave her now. He would figure this out, whatever it took. He just didn't know how. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the room, but it felt as though the weight of the world was still pressing down on Jake's shoulders. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes lost in thought. Emma had been quiet for the last few hours, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. She had no idea what was coming next, and neither did he. The promise he had made to her still lingered in his mind. He couldn't walk away, but he didn't know what to do. He had been running from his past for so long, hiding behind the Hell's Angels, keeping his emotions locked away where no one could reach them. But now, with Emma, it was different. He couldn't hide anymore. "You're not alone," he had told her earlier, but even as he said the words, he wondered if he was lying. He had no family. He had no real connections. And now, here he was, tied to this little girl who needed him, but he didn't even know how to help her. As the room grew darker, Jake stood up and walked over to the small window. The town outside was eerily quiet, the rain having stopped hours ago, but the streets were still wet, glistening under the dim streetlights. He had no idea where Emma's family was, or if they were even alive. But he couldn't leave her here, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to turn to. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He didn't have the answers, but he knew he couldn't let her face whatever was coming alone. Emma stirred behind him, the sound of her movement pulling him back to reality. "Jake!" Her voice was soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be speaking at all. He turned around, his gaze softening as he looked at her. She was sitting up now, the blanket still wrapped around her small frame, her eyes wide with that same uncertainty. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake took a deep breath, his chest tight. He had no idea how to answer her. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he couldn't lie to her either. "I don't know," he said, his voice rough with the honesty of it. "But I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I'll figure something out." Emma nodded slowly, though her expression didn't change. She was still scared, still uncertain, and he couldn't blame her. She had every reason to be. He knew all too well what it felt like to be abandoned, to have no one. He had been there before, and he didn't want that for her. But even as he said the words, he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. He had a feeling that whatever was going on with her, It was bigger than just a simple storm. He needed to find out what happened to her family, to make sure she was safe, but he had no idea where to start. There were no answers here, not in this small town, not in the life he had carved out for himself. Jake had been living in the shadows for so long, hiding from his past, that he had no idea how to step into the light. But Emma had made him see something he had forgotten existed: hope. She needed him, and for the first time in years, Jake felt like he had a purpose. He had never been a hero. He had never wanted to be. But now he had to be. "I'll figure this out, Emma," he said, his voice more certain now. "You're not alone in this." She looked at him, and for the first time, Jake saw something other than fear in her eyes. It was a spark of trust, small but growing, as if she believed him, even if only a little. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, though he felt a deep ache in his chest. He didn't know how he was going to do this. He didn't know where to go or who to ask for help. But he wasn't going to let her down. He wasn't going to walk away. The storm outside had passed, but a new storm was brewing inside him, and he couldn't run from it any longer. He had to face it, for Emma's sake. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the handle. He needed to make some calls, find some answers. He didn't have all the answers, but he was going to start somewhere. As he opened the door, he looked back at Emma, who was now watching him with a look of quiet determination. She was scared, but she was strong. He could see that now. He couldn't protect her from everything, but he would do everything he could to help her find the safety she deserved. As Jake stepped out into the night, the weight of the world still on his shoulders, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away from this. Not now. Not ever. The morning air was crisp, the kind of chill that signaled a change was coming. Jake stood outside the motel, his back leaning against the cold brick wall, as he stared at the fading storm clouds. The sun was trying to break through, but the world still felt heavy, like a storm that hadn't quite finished yet. He ran his hand through his damp hair, still trying to shake off the remnants of last night. The adrenaline, the fear, the feeling of responsibility that now weighed on him. He had told Emma that everything would be okay, that he would figure it out, but deep down, Jake had no idea how. He had spent his whole life running, hiding from commitments, keeping people at arm's length. Now, here he was, with a young girl who needed him, and he had no clue how to help her. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see Emma standing there, but instead, it was a man in a long coat. The stranger looked familiar, but Jake couldn't place him right away. The man stepped closer, his face hardened by years of experience, his eyes cold and calculating. Jake tensed, instinctively reaching for the knife tucked in his jacket. "You're Jake, right?" the man asked, his voice low and steady. Jake didn't answer at first, but his hand never left the knife. "I don't know you," Jake said, narrowing his eyes. The man didn't flinch. "No, but I know you. You've been protecting her." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He hadn't realized how much he had been trying to protect Emma until now. He had barely gotten to know her, but already, she had somehow found a place in his heart. "Who the hell are you?" Jake asked again, his voice colder now, filled with suspicion. The man sighed, as if he had been expecting this reaction. "I'm someone who knows what you've gotten yourself into, Jake. And I'm here to make sure things don't get worse." Jake's grip on the knife tightened. "What do you mean by that?" "What I mean is that little girl you're looking after, Emma. She's not just some innocent bystander," the man said, his tone darkening. "She's connected to something bigger. Something you don't want to get mixed up in." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had known something wasn't right about Emma's situation, but he hadn't expected this. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. The man stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving Jake's. "Her family, they were involved in something. Something dangerous. And now she's caught in the middle of it. They're going to come for her, Jake. And they won't stop until they get what they want." The words sank in slowly, but when they did, they hit like a freight train. Emma had already been through enough. She had lost her family. She had been thrown into a storm of chaos, and now this. Jake felt a surge of anger rise up inside him. He had already promised to protect her, and now it seemed like the world was conspiring against him. The man seemed to sense the change in Jake. "You don't have to believe me," he said. "But you should know that you're in over your head. If you want to keep her safe, you need to trust me." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Why should I trust you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, He glanced around, as if making sure no one was watching. Then he stepped even closer, lowering his voice. Because I'm the one who can help you figure this out. I know who's looking for her, and I can help you protect her. But you have to trust me. Jake considered his words carefully. He had never been one to trust easily, especially not someone who showed up out of nowhere claiming to know more than he did. But the truth was, Jake didn't know what to do. He had been living in the shadows for so long. He had no idea how to navigate this new world he had found himself in. What's your game? Jake asked, still on edge. The man looked him square in the eye. I'm trying to keep a little girl alive. That's all. You help me. I help you. Jake didn't respond right away. He needed time to think, to process everything the man had just told him. But before he could say anything else, the man stepped back, his face softening slightly. You're going to have to move fast if you want to keep her safe. They're closer than you think. With that, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Jake stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't ignore what he had just heard. Emma was in danger, and no matter how hard he tried to protect her, there were forces at work that he didn't understand. The storm was far from over. Jake had no choice now. He had to find out the truth, and he had to do it fast. With a heavy sigh, he turned and headed back inside the motel room. Emma was still there, still waiting for answers. And he was the only one who could give them to her. Jake paced back and forth in the small motel room, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. The words from the mysterious man echoed in his mind, each one heavier than the last. Emma was still asleep, her chest rising and falling gently with each breath, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. The man had said they were coming for her, that she was connected to something dangerous, something bigger than either of them understood. And as much as Jake hated to admit it, he knew that. He had no choice but to believe him. He had seen enough to know when things weren't just random. He had been part of the Hells Angels long enough to recognize when the stakes were higher than they seemed. And this wasn't just some coincidence. Emma was caught in the middle of something, and if he didn't act fast, she could end up paying the price. The door creaked open, pulling Jake from his thoughts. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he kept tucked in his waistband. But it was only Emma standing in the doorway. She looked tired, her eyes still red from the tears she had shed earlier, but there was something else there now. Something stronger. Jake? She said quietly, her voice hesitant. Are you okay? Jake paused for a moment, not sure how to answer her. He didn't want to scare her, but the truth was, he wasn't sure if he was okay. I'm fine, he finally said, forcing a smile. I'm just thinking. She stepped into the room, her small frame hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to stay or leave. Thinking about what? She asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew he couldn't keep hiding things from her. She deserved to know the truth, even if it scared her. There's something going on, Emma, he said, his voice low. Something bigger than both of us. And I think we're in the middle of it. Emma's eyes widened, her face filled with confusion and fear. What do you mean? What's going on? Jake didn't answer right away. He wanted to protect her from all of it, wanted to keep her safe from whatever was coming. But the truth was, he couldn't. She was already involved, already in danger. And the only thing he could do now was keep her close and hope that somehow, they'd be able to figure it out together. I don't know everything yet, Jake said finally. But I'm going to find out. We're going to find out. But you need to stay with me. You need to stay close. Emma nodded slowly, still processing everything Jake had said. She stepped further into the room, standing just a few feet away from him. I don't want to be alone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The vulnerability in her words hit Jake harder than he expected. She had already been through so much, and now, here she was, asking him to keep her safe. He didn't know if he was the right person to do that, but he knew he couldn't turn her away. You're not alone, he said softly, taking a step closer. I'm not going anywhere. I promise. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. Jake had no answers, no plans, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away from her now. He couldn't. There was a knock on the door, and both of them froze. Jake instinctively reached for his knife, his heart racing, but he forced himself to stay calm. Stay here, he whispered to Emma, his voice low. Don't make a sound. He moved toward the door, his steps quiet as he approached. He looked through the peephole, and saw nothing but a shadow in the hallway. He opened the door cautiously, his hand still on the knife, but when he saw who it was, his heart skipped a beat. It was the man from last night, the one who had warned him about Emma's past, the one who seemed to know more than he should. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice cold, his eyes scanning the room behind Jake. "Not here," Jake replied quickly, his mind racing. "Not now. It's important," the man insisted. "They're getting closer. You don't have much time." Jake hesitated, glancing back at Emma, who was standing in the corner of the room, her eyes wide with confusion. He knew he couldn't keep her in the dark for much longer. She needed to know what was going on, but he wasn't sure how to break it to her without scaring her more than she already was. "All right," Jake said finally, stepping aside. "But you're coming with me. We'll talk outside." The man nodded, stepping into the room. Jake grabbed his jacket, his knife still hidden in the waistband, and motioned for Emma to follow him. "You stay close," he told her, his voice firm. "We'll figure this out. I promise." Together, they walked out into the cold night, the shadows of danger closing in around them. But Jake wasn't about to let it consume them. He was going to protect her, no matter what it took. Jake walked briskly down the street, the man from last night trailing closely behind. Emma kept up with them, her footsteps lighter than Jake's, but she stayed close, glancing up at him every few seconds. He could see the fear still etched in her face, but there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before. Determination. She was scared, but she was no longer hiding it. She was beginning to trust him, even though neither of them knew what was coming next. As they reached the alley where Jake had parked his bike, the man spoke again, his voice low and urgent. "You've got to move faster. They're already on their way." Jake turned to face him, his hand instinctively going to the handle of his knife, hidden under his jacket. "Who's coming for her?" Jake's voice was thick with suspicion, but the man didn't flinch. He just looked at Jake with that cold, calculating gaze, and then glanced at Emma. "It's not just about her," the man replied. "It's about everything. Her family was mixed up with people you don't want to know. People who don't care who gets hurt." Jake's heart clenched, the weight of the man's words settling in. He had known Emma was in danger, but hearing it put so plainly made it feel so much more real. She wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was tied to something dangerous. The storm wasn't just a metaphor. They were in the middle of it. "We need to get moving," the man added, his voice sharpening. "I'll take you to a place where you can lay low, but you need to trust me. Time's running out." Jake looked at Emma. She was standing a few feet away, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but also with a new sense of determination. He could see it in the way she held herself now. She was ready to fight, ready to face whatever was coming. But Jake knew that they couldn't face it alone. They needed help, and it had to come from the man who seemed to know too much. Jake nodded, making up his mind. "Lead the way." The man didn't hesitate. He turned and walked quickly down the alley, with Jake and Emma following closely behind. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together the mystery of Emma's family, the danger they were in, and the man who seemed to have all the answers. But every time he thought he might get close, another question popped up, sending him spiraling again. They reached a nondescript van parked at the end of the alley. The man opened the side door and gestured for them to get in. Jake hesitated, but only for a moment. The danger was too real, and the stakes too high. He didn't trust this man fully, but he knew they had no other choice. Emma climbed into the back of the van first, her small figure disappearing into the dim interior. Jake followed closely behind, his eyes scanning their surroundings, his hand on the knife at his side, ready for anything. Once they were inside, the man closed the door behind them with a soft thud and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and the van pulled away, the sound of the tires against the wet pavement echoing in the stillness of the night. The streets outside were eerily quiet, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. As they drove through the winding streets, Jake sat in silence, his thoughts still spinning. Emma sat beside him, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. He could feel the tension radiating off her, and he knew she was scared. She hadn't said much since they left the motel, but he could tell that she was struggling to process everything that had happened. "You're doing fine," Jake said quietly, glancing over at her. She didn't look up at him at first, but then she slowly turned her head, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze now, something he hadn't seen before. A flicker of hope. "I just want to be safe," she whispered. "I don't want to be scared anymore." Jake nodded, understanding more than she could know. He had spent his whole life running from fear, running from the past. But now, for the first time, he didn't feel like he was alone. Emma needed him, and no matter what it took, he wasn't going to let her down. "We're going to be okay," Jake said softly, more to himself than to her. "I'm going to make sure of it." The man turned down a side street, pulling into a quiet, secluded area. The van came to a stop in front of a large, old building that looked abandoned. Jake's instincts flared, and he felt a surge of unease. This wasn't a place he would have ever chosen to stay, but he knew there was no other option. "This is the safest place for now," the man said, glancing at Jake in the rearview mirror. "But it won't be for long. You need to move quickly." The door opened, and the man stepped out, signaling for Jake and Emma to follow. They stepped into the cold night air, and Jake felt the weight of the situation settle deeper in his bones. They were on the run now, and there was no turning back. The storm was far from over, and if Jake had any hope of keeping Emma safe, he had to face whatever was coming next. The building loomed ahead, its dark, weathered exterior standing in stark contrast to the quiet stillness of the night. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what had happened and what was yet to come pressing down on Jake's chest. He stepped out of the van, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground, and turned to Emma, who was hesitating behind him. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, the fear still there, but now there was something else too. Determination. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. "This is where we stay for now," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "We'll be safe here, but we need to stay alert." Emma nodded, but said nothing. She was processing, trying to make sense of everything. Jake couldn't blame her. He was still trying to make sense of it all too. He didn't know how long they would stay here, or if they would even be safe. But right now, it was the only option. They walked inside, the door creaking as they pushed it open. The room they entered was dimly lit, with dust hanging in the air like a blanket. It was a far cry from the comfort of the motel room they'd left behind, but it was better than being out there in the streets with no protection. The man who had led them here didn't speak as he closed the door behind them. He simply motioned for Jake and Emma to follow him into the back. As they walked deeper into the building, the smell of old wood and rusted metal grew stronger. It felt like the building had been abandoned for years, and maybe it had. Jake wasn't sure what kind of place this was, but he wasn't going to ask questions just yet. Not until they were alone. They reached a small room at the back, and the man gestured for them to sit. "You'll be safe here for the time being," he said, his voice gruff. "But you need to know this. They won't stop. Whoever is after her, they're not going to give up." Jake clenched his fists at his sides. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it from the man made it all too real. "How do you know all this?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice even. "I've been watching," the man replied simply. "I've been keeping an eye on her for a while. And now, it's too late to back out. You're in it now, whether you like it or not." Jake didn't like the sound of that. He had hoped this would be over quickly, that he could just help Emma and move on. But it was clear now that things were far more complicated than that. He looked over at Emma, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her legs. She was still processing, still trying to figure out what had happened to her. She had no idea what she was about to be pulled into. But Jake would make sure she didn't have to face it alone. He would stand by her. "What exactly is going on?" Jake asked, turning his attention back to the man. "Her family. They were involved in something dangerous," the man said, his eyes flicking toward Emma for a moment before returning to Jake. "Something they shouldn't have been. And now, there are people looking for her. People who won't stop until they get what they want. You need to be ready for anything." Jake let out a slow breath, his mind spinning. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. This was bigger than him, bigger than her, and there was no way out. He had made a promise to protect her, and now he had to see it through. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice steady but urgent. The man took a deep breath, then looked at him. "You stay put for now. Keep your heads down, and I'll try to find out who's coming after her. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know who these people were or why they were after Emma, but he wasn't going to let them take her. Not while he was breathing. "How long do we have?" Jake asked, glancing at the man. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. "I'll be back soon. You stay here, and don't go anywhere. And with that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the door. He felt the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The room was still, the only sound the occasional creak of the old building settling. Emma was still sitting in the corner, her head resting on her knees. He could see how fragile she seemed now, how much she had been through. But she was strong. She had to be. He wasn't sure how long they'd be here, but they couldn't stay locked in this room forever. Jake walked over to Emma, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to be okay," he said quietly, though the doubt in his mind was hard to ignore. Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. "I don't know if I believe that," she whispered, her voice soft. "But I want to." Jake smiled gently, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You will," he said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." The sound of the door creaking open interrupted the moment. Jake tensed, his hand instinctively going to his knife again. But it was just the man, returning sooner than expected. "We need to move," the man said urgently, his eyes scanning the room. "They found us." Jake's heart raced as the man's words sank in. "They found us," the man said urgently, his eyes darting to the door. Jake's hand went to the knife at his side instinctively, but the urgency in the man's voice left him no time to think. He grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to move, now." Jake didn't wait for a response. He didn't have to. Emma's fear mirrored his own, but there was no time for hesitation. They rushed toward the back of the room, and Jake's mind raced. He had no plan, no escape route, just instincts. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, faint but unmistakable. The man was already ahead, leading the way through the maze of corridors and out into the cold night. As they reached the back door, Jake paused for just a moment, his ears straining to catch any movement behind them. "This way," the man urged, pulling open a rusted door that led into an alleyway. The streetlights outside were dim, casting long shadows over the narrow passage. They moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but Jake could hear the rapid, shallow breaths of Emma behind him. He knew she was scared, but there was no time for comfort, no time to slow down. The man led them around corners, down alleyways, weaving through the darkened streets. Jake's mind was still spinning. Who were these people after Emma? Why had they been tracking her? And how the hell had they found them so fast? "Where are we going?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice low. The man didn't answer immediately, but his pace quickened. They turned a corner and came to a stop in front of a nondescript van. The man opened the door and gestured for them to get inside. "Hurry, we don't have much time," he said. Jake didn't hesitate. He pushed Emma inside first, then climbed in behind her. The man slammed the door shut and quickly jumped into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and the van sped off, cutting through the night with a screech of tires. Jake leaned forward, his eyes scanning the dark streets as the van raced down them. "Who are these people?" Jake asked again, his voice laced with frustration. "Who's after her?" The man's face was hard to read in the dim light, but Jake could see the tension in his jaw. "I told you," the man said, his voice cold. "Her family was involved in something dangerous. Now they're paying the price. And you're in it now, too." Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't just about a little girl anymore. This was about something bigger, something far more dangerous. He had tried to stay out of it, but now it was clear there was no running. They were both caught in something they couldn't escape from. The van turned down another dark street, and Jake's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The van skidded to a stop in front of a large, abandoned building. The man slammed the gear shift into park and turned to face Jake. "We stay here for now," the man said, his tone firm. "This is our safe house." Jake didn't believe him. Nothing about this situation felt safe. "How do you know it's safe?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "We're sitting ducks out here." The man's eyes hardened. "You want to be the hero, Jake? Or do you want to keep Emma alive?" Jake felt a wave of anger wash over him, but he bit back the words. They didn't have time for this. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice low but resolute. The man opened the door and stepped out, motioning for Jake and Emma to follow. As they walked toward the building, the wind howled, sending a chill through Jake's bones. They stepped into the darkness of the building, the door creaking as it closed behind them. The man led them down a narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Stay close," he said, glancing back at Jake and Emma. "And don't make a sound." They reached a room at the end of the hall, and the man opened the door, revealing a small, sparsely furnished space. "We'll rest here for now," he said, stepping inside. Jake glanced at Emma, who was clinging to his side, her face pale. She was scared, but there was nothing he could say to comfort her now. He needed to protect her. That was all that mattered. The man closed the door behind them and turned to face Jake. "You'll need to stay alert," he said, his tone grim. "They know where you are? They won't stop until they have her." Jake's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a fight to keep Emma safe. This was a fight to survive. The storm had come for them, and there was nowhere to hide. "I'm not letting them take her," Jake said, his voice hard. "You better be right about this place." The man gave a short nod, his expression unreadable. "I am," he said simply. But the real fight's just begun. The building was eerily quiet, the silence almost deafening after the frantic rush of the last few hours. Jake paced the small room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with each passing minute. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. They were hiding out in a dilapidated safe house. But even here, Jake didn't feel safe. There were too many unknowns. Too many questions he couldn't answer. Emma sat in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around her legs, her eyes distant. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with exhaustion. She had been through so much in such a short time, and Jake knew she wasn't processing it all. "Not yet." "Hey," Jake said softly, trying to break the silence. Emma didn't look up at first, but she eventually turned her head, her eyes meeting his. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shrugged, the weight of the world clearly pressing on her small shoulders. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't understand any of this." Jake walked over and sat next to her, careful not to crowd her space. "I don't either," he admitted, his voice rough with frustration. "But we'll get through it. Together." She nodded, though Jake could tell she wasn't convinced. She wanted to believe him. But how could she, when everything had been turned upside down so quickly? How could she trust him when he didn't even know what they were up against? The man who had led them to the safe house had left them alone for the time being, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. The people after Emma weren't going to stop. And now, Jake wasn't just protecting her from the storm. They were up against a far more dangerous enemy. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. What if they come here? Emma's voice broke the silence again, barely above a whisper. Jake looked over at her, his heart aching at the uncertainty in her eyes. He wanted to tell her everything was going to be okay, that he would protect her no matter what. But he couldn't make that promise, not when the situation was so uncertain. "We'll be ready," he said, his voice as firm as he could make it. "I won't let them take you." Emma gave him a small, uncertain smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Jake why he had to keep going. He wasn't just protecting her from the danger that lurked outside. He was protecting her from the fear that was slowly taking over. But Jake knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The man had said he would find out who was after them, but Jake didn't trust him completely. He was only one step ahead, and that wasn't enough. As the night dragged on, the building remained eerily quiet, but Jake's mind couldn't rest. Every creak of the old structure, every sound outside the room, made him tense. The calm before the storm was suffocating. He couldn't sit here any longer. They had to get moving. Jake stood up abruptly, his decision made. "We need to find out what's going on," he said, turning to Emma. She looked up at him, her face drawn with exhaustion, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes. "What do we do?" she asked. Jake hesitated. He didn't have a clear plan, but he couldn't sit here and wait to be found. "We can't just wait for them to come to us," he said, his voice steady now. "We need to take control of this." Emma nodded, still unsure, but willing to follow his lead. Jake paced for a moment, thinking. He couldn't just keep hiding. He needed to make a move, find out who was after them and why. He turned to Emma. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice firm but comforting. "We're not going to let anyone hurt you. Not while I'm around." She nodded, her eyes still filled with doubt but trusting him, at least for now. Jake knew he couldn't protect her from everything, but he wasn't going to let her face it alone. He walked to the door, his hand on the handle, and took one last look at Emma. "Let's go," he said, his voice quiet but determined. The door creaked open, and they stepped into the hallway. Jake's senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the stillness. The old building creaked as they moved through it, and Jake could hear his own heart pounding in his chest. He was walking into the unknown, and he had no idea what he was going to find. But there was no turning back now. They had to move forward. He wasn't going to let Emma down, not after everything she had already been through. They stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting their faces, and Jake knew that whatever was coming, they would face it together. They had to. There was no other choice. The night was colder than before, the air biting as Jake led Emma through the dark streets. They hadn't said much in the last few minutes, both caught up in the weight of what had just happened. Jake's mind was racing, but his instincts were sharp. He kept his eyes on their surroundings, his hand on the knife at his side, ready for anything. The old building they had left behind felt like a distant memory now. It had been their refuge for just a short time, but they couldn't afford to stay. Not when the people after Emma were closing in. The man who had led them there had warned them that it was only a matter of time before the danger found them. Jake had no idea where to go from here, but he knew they couldn't stay put. "Stay close to me," Jake muttered to Emma, his voice low. She nodded silently, but Jake could tell she was frightened. The look in her eyes had shifted, from uncertainty to something more, something that made her look older than her years. She wasn't just the scared little girl anymore. She was a survivor. They kept moving, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The streets were deserted, the only sound the soft rustle of wind and the occasional car driving by. Jake turned down an alley, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. The adrenaline still buzzed in his veins, his heart racing as he searched for the next step. They were running out of time. "Jake, what's going on?" Emma's voice broke the silence, quieter than usual, almost afraid to ask. Jake glanced at her, his brow furrowed. She wasn't a child anymore, and he could see that she was starting to understand just how dangerous their situation was. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice more honest than he meant it to be. "But we're going to figure it out." He had promised her that much, even though the truth was, Jake was just as lost as she was. All he knew was that they couldn't keep running forever. They needed answers. They needed to know who was behind this. "I'm scared," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart broke at the sound of her words, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. "I know, Emma, but I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I promise." He could see her hesitate, her small figure staying a step behind him, but she didn't argue. She trusted him. That was all that mattered right now. "We'll find somewhere safe," Jake said, more to himself than to Emma. "We'll get through this." They kept walking, moving faster now, and Jake's mind shifted into overdrive. He needed to think. He needed to figure out how to get them out of this. As they reached another street corner, Jake spotted something up ahead. A car parked on the side of the road, its headlights dim. It looked like an old, beat-up sedan, but there was something about it that caught his attention. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but his instincts screamed at him to be careful. "Get down," Jake hissed, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her into the shadows. She froze, her wide eyes looking up at him in confusion. Jake motioned for her to stay quiet, his body tense as he watched the sedan. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. Jake's heart pounded as he recognized the silhouette, his body going on high alert. It was one of the men from earlier, the ones who had been following them. He wasn't sure how they had found them, but the man was definitely looking for something. Jake's grip on the knife tightened, his pulse quickening. The man walked toward the entrance of a building, glancing over his shoulder once before disappearing into the shadows. "We can't stay here," Jake said urgently. "We have to go." Emma's face was pale as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Now we run," Jake replied, his voice firm. He wasn't going to wait around to find out what they were looking for. They couldn't afford to. The man had left, but that didn't mean they were safe. If they didn't move, they would be sitting ducks. Jake pulled Emma along, moving as quickly as they could without making a sound. He wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay on the streets. They needed to find somewhere, anywhere, safe. The sound of footsteps from behind made Jake's heart skip a beat. Someone was following them. They had to be. "Move faster," Jake urged, pushing Emma ahead of him. His mind raced as they rounded another corner, eyes darting back and forth, trying to stay one step ahead. He could hear the footfalls behind them, growing louder. Whoever was after them wasn't far behind. "Jake, I'm scared," Emma said, her voice cracking. Jake's heart ached as he heard her words, but he didn't let up. He couldn't stop. He had promised to keep her safe, and he wasn't going to break that promise. "I'm not going to let them hurt you," he said, his voice firm with conviction. He didn't know how he was going to stop whoever was after them, but he wasn't going to let Emma down. Not now. Not ever. They turned down another alley, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The pursuit was getting closer, but Jake kept moving, leading Emma down into the darkness, hoping they could lose whoever was trailing them. The tension in the air was unbearable, the weight of the chase settling in his chest. This wasn't just about running anymore. It was about survival. Jake pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he led Emma deeper into the shadows of the alley. The footsteps behind them had been getting closer, faster, and now it was clear they were being pursued. The dark alleyways twisted and turned in front of them, but Jake didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The danger was real, and Emma's safety was all that mattered. She was still a few paces behind, her breathing heavy, and Jake could feel the fear radiating from her. He couldn't show her the fear that gripped him as well, though. He had to be strong for her. "Keep up, Emma," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. He looked over his shoulder, spotting the silhouette of a man rounding the corner behind them. The pursuit wasn't far off now. They couldn't outrun them for long. They needed to find a way out. "This way," Jake barked, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her down another alley. She stumbled slightly, but kept pace, not letting go. He had to get them out of this mess, and he needed a plan, fast. The alley seemed endless, each turn revealing more darkened corners, but nothing that offered any real escape. "Where are we going?" Emma panted, her voice shaking. Jake had no answer. They were running on instinct now, and there wasn't a clear path ahead. "Just stay with me," Jake said, trying to calm her, but his own anxiety was rising. He could hear the footsteps now, louder, closer, and then a shout. It was clear they were getting closer. The man who had warned them was right. They were after Emma, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. As they reached the end of the alley, Jake paused, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape. His mind raced, trying to think of anything that could help. There, a fire escape ladder. It was rusty, old, and probably wasn't the safest option, but it was the only one they had. "Up there," Jake said urgently, pointing to the fire escape. Emma's eyes widened as she looked up. "I don't think I can climb that," she whispered. Jake's heart clenched. She was scared, and rightfully so, but they didn't have time to waste. "I'll help you," he said, pulling her forward. "You trust me?" She nodded hesitantly, still unsure, but she followed as Jake moved toward the bottom of the ladder. He reached up, grabbed the first rung, and began to climb. Emma followed closely, her hands trembling but determined. As they ascended, Jake's thoughts raced. They were so close now. If they could just get to the roof, they might be able to find another way out, or at least get some time to figure things out. But the footsteps weren't fading. They were still coming. Jake could hear the low murmur of voices below, growing louder as they closed in. He glanced down, making sure Emma was still behind him. She was slower than him, but she was still moving. She had a fire in her, and that made him feel a little better. The noise from below grew louder, more urgent. Jake reached the top of the ladder, grabbing the edge of the roof, pulling himself up, and then reaching down to help Emma. She scrambled up beside him, her eyes wide, still filled with fear, but she was holding it together. "We've got to move," Jake said, glancing around the roof. It was a large building, and it seemed like they had a little more time. The pursuit hadn't reached the rooftop yet, but Jake wasn't about to wait and see. They needed to stay ahead. "This way," he said, taking her hand and leading her across the roof. They ran silently, the wind in their faces as they moved toward the edge of the building. The city stretched out before them, dark and quiet, but it felt like they were still in the middle of the storm. They needed a plan. They needed help. But for now, they just needed to survive. As they reached the edge of the roof, Jake's eyes darted to the next building over. It wasn't far. They could make it. He turned to Emma, his voice steady but urgent. "We have to jump. It's not far, but you have to trust me." Emma hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "Jake, you have to trust me," he repeated, his voice firm. She looked at him, and for a moment, Jake thought she might back out. But then she nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. Okay. Jake took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and then he jumped, pulling Emma with him. The ground rushed toward them, but they landed hard, rolling to absorb the shock. It wasn't a perfect landing, but it worked. They were on the next building, and they were still alive. They both gasped for breath, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Emma looked at him, her face flushed, and for the first time in hours, Jake saw a spark of relief in her eyes. They had made it. But he knew this wasn't over. The danger was still there, and the fight wasn't over. They had just bought themselves a little more time. And that was enough. For now, Jake stood up first, pulling Emma to her feet. We keep moving, he said, his voice low but steady. We don't stop until we find somewhere safe. Emma nodded, her eyes still wide but more determined than ever. She was stronger than Jake had given her credit for, and in that moment, he knew they had a chance. They had each other, and as long as they did, they would keep fighting. The storm outside raged on, but Jake wasn't going to let it drown them. Not now. Not ever. I've been following the journey of these incredible Hell Angels stories, where the lines between good and bad are blurred, and survival is the only thing that matters. In these stories, we see a biker who's committed to protecting a young girl in danger, caught in a deadly pursuit by those who won't stop until they get what they want. Hell Angel stories are not just about motorcycles. They're about grit, determination, and loyalty in the face of life-threatening danger. The characters in these stories will do whatever it takes to survive, pushing themselves to the limit to stay ahead of those who want to bring them down. These Hell Angel stories remind us that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a chance for redemption, as long as you're willing to fight for what's right. As the storm rages on, the young girl and the biker must navigate a world filled with uncertainty, betrayal, and unspoken threats, showing that survival depends not only on physical strength, but the will to never give up. These Hell Angel stories captivate audiences with their raw emotion and thrilling plots, showing that the real battle often happens not on the streets, but deep within the soul. Every chapter of these Hell Angel stories takes us further into the heart of danger, where trust, loyalty, and survival are the only things keeping the characters alive.